Inside Up has done it again and added to a series. This one is the next game after Block and Key, which is a game I like very, very much. And this one kind of carries the torch, so to speak.
Yeah, so to speak. No, don't carry it too close.
Because there's ice involved.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, it's a lot of plastic.
Bad pun, I'm sorry.
It was a bad pun. But this is Ice and Idols, the next one from Inside Up Games. And sort of the Block and Key universe, if you will. This is a pick up and deliver game that's going to be changing on you constantly. Yep. So if you think you're going to pick this up and deliver it, it might change on you, especially as players play around the table and things happen, because this board, as you see right here, is going to change quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, thematically, you'll see some similarities to Block and Key, but the gameplay is very different.
Yes.
What is the same, if you like that game, is it's still a puzzle. You're solving this kind of puzzle, but this time it's about the movement, like David alluded to. All of these different blocks here are technically ice. They're, plastic, but they're ice. And they will shift, they will move, they will collapse, entire rows will change, and your position on them might change and shift as well as people are manipulating this board. Not only that, this entire board can actually rotate. We've got a prototype here that isn't as functional as the final copy will be, but all of this movement is happening as you're trying to get from point A to point B. So it's not, like you said, it's not just about finding the right path. You got to hope that path is still there when your turn comes back around.
Right. And what you're trying to do is collect these idols. As you can see through some of the ice here, I'll remove one of these pieces. There's where you can get a green idol. Up here, there's a space where you could get a green or the pink idol. Whenever you're on one of the tiles above that space, you can spend an action point to pick it up. Action points are what the game is all about. On your turn, at the beginning of the game anyway, you're going to have 5 action points to spend each turn. You can spend these to move around, and when you move around, you can move to an orthogonally adjacent tile, but it has to be connected by a path, and you can't move through the walls. Some of these pieces are unique in that they're sort of like crosses, and you can go over one way or under the bridge the other way, but you can't kind of turn on those. And then there's some that are like these roundabouts effectively that allow you to all the flexibility you want to move around, but you're going to be spending those points moving around, maybe picking up an idol, putting it in your hand, which are these 2 spaces on your player board. At the beginning of the game, you can only hold 1 at a time, but you might unlock a power that lets you hold 2. And then ultimately you're wanting to take it back to the corresponding place for that specific idol. And this is where you have a choice.
Yeah, and that's what I think makes this game a little bit more interesting than just picking up and delivering, because the delivery is important. You can choose to do 2 things. You can place your delivery on your player board, and you'll notice there's 1 spot for every different idol. Every delivery that you place onto your board is going to give you an extra power. It's going to give you an extra action point to spend, which is incredibly crucial. It's going to give you the ability to hold 2 idols or some actions that you can then take to manipulate the board in ways that other players can't. There's one that lets you move tiles and cover some of these gaps. There's one that lets you rotate the board. Again, by spending those hard-earned action points. So you are going to start with a very basic asymmetric player power, but then you're going to kind of expand upon that by unlocking these abilities. And by the end, you're going to be doing stuff with the board that no other player is going to be able to do.
Right. The other thing that's going to happen when you place an idol on your player board is it's going to trigger an event. There's this deck of event cards, and you're going to take the top card off of that. And this does a number of things that you have to resolve right then and there. It's going to potentially collapse some of the ice. So for instance, the last one I did was right here. This happened. So we removed this. So you're actually going to lose pieces of ice. This one lets you shift a column or row, and it kind of shows you from what side to which other side you're going to shift those. And the tiles will wrap as you shift them, things like that. This one lets you rotate the board. And I say let's. Sometimes you don't want this to happen.
Often you don't want it to, honestly.
But these things are going to happen. Sometimes they'll help. Sometimes they'll hurt. Now that's just with respect to putting your idols on your board. The other place you can put them is back in the supply. And when you do that, you're researching that idol.
Yeah, and this is kind of like a track, but you're not really going up it. You're just filling in the next available spot on this research board up here. Each one of these columns is worth points. So for every cube, for example, I placed it here when I turned in the green idol, it's going to give me 5 points at the end of the game per cube that I have in there. But you'll notice that some of these spots are going to give you more points, so they're going to become more valuable. But there's also a trick here, because your points aren't necessarily guaranteed.
No.
Because there's ways in the game to actually shift these. Some of these spaces that you go to are going to let you remove these point tiles and shift everything over. So the spot that you thought all of your cubes were worth 8 points, it might not be worth 5. So you've got to watch out for that as well on that track.
You might stack up in one that's low points and hope at the end that you might be able to get one of those powers to let you shift. So now you have 8 points instead of 5 points or whatever, something like that. But it's a really interesting dynamic set of tracks that you can go up. And the game is going to end once someone has filled in, or all the players have filled in 4 of those tracks, or someone's placed all of their 10 cubes over on that research track.
That's going to be hard, though. That means that's going to be tough to put all 10 of these
because
on
I can
there.
tell you, when you're playing this, after you get your first idol and you have it to hand in, you might want to research, but boy, is it really tempting to go ahead and get some powers so that you can actually manipulate things a little bit more.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a big part of the game, is kind of determining that, because, yeah, you think the points are great early, and you think if you get more points, but some of these powers are going to come in very handy. Yeah. Now, I teased earlier that there's an asymmetric player power, and everybody does start with one base power. Like mine, let me spend some action points to jump over tiles onto the next tile. So you do have something innate that will let you get out of these positions. But keep in mind that other players are going to be using their powers and some of their abilities and those cards, not just to help themselves, but also to block you and to force you into some positions that are very difficult to get out of.
100%. I had the sculptor, and it says for 3 action points, I can swap my tile or an adjacent tile with a discarded tile. Normally you start the game with no discarded tiles, but if someone's using the sculptor, you have one more piece that's off the side of the board, so you have a discarded pile. And I could change that. And I think when we played, I thought, should I change the one for me to help me, or should I change the one to hurt Ryan,
right, to block me from
doing the thing that I know he was about to do on his next turn? So definitely has some cutthroat moments.
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, the keysmith, when you jump, you have to have a place to land. So if you take away the place to land you're just like in trouble. You're stuck there where you thought you'd have a way to go.
Yeah, and there are 2 other characters that you can choose from, but it is a really interesting sort of thinky, because it's not as simple as you think when you're just like, oh, you just move around to these places. These paths are changing significantly, and the one thing that I think surprised us both is when you rotate things, you're like, how much is that going to change something? I mean, it changes something completely, because you might rotate it, and now I was about to move one space over to the space that I wanted to go to, but because all of those icons are not part of the board that you're rotating.
Right, they stay where they are.
They stay where they are.
You just swirl around the outside.
You might have had that one path to get there, and now that one path goes off in a different direction.
Yeah, so the game is going to continue throughout this by, every player trying to fight for those idols, turning in those idols. We talked about how the game ends. And scoring, again, it's a pretty unique situation because you are scoring those different rows. Each one of these columns is going to score differently. And I should mention, if a row is ever filled up or a column is ever filled up, you do kind of lock in those points. So there's a certain level in which you can, decide, I'm going to lock this in and no one can change it. But the places where you're placing these cubes here are important, not just because you're getting points for some of these different spaces, but also you're trying to fulfill an objective card that you chose at the beginning of the game.
Yeah, for instance, mine here, I'd get 10 points at the end of the game if I had 3 in any one column. Now, in a 2-player game, that's tricky because you fill the bottom 2 spaces with a neutral cube. So some of these columns only have 2. So I'm looking at really only 3 columns where this is possible.
That's why it's 10 points. And mine is 8 points, but it's a little bit more forgiving. I can make this pattern pretty much anywhere on this board right now, even with the 2-player disadvantage.
Yeah, we also, I don't think pointed this out, but each of those spaces also not only activates different powers like shifting the point tiles, but some of them will also do some more of those events, so it really impacts this a lot more. Some of them are just extra points if you have your cube there.
Yeah, and I think it's really difficult. You'll have to kind of see the game in action or see the game played to really understand how different the board is going to look. Even in a 2-player game that we played, you think you have a turn planned out, and even just with David's turn, it would change so significantly that I have to rethink my plan, which for me, I like that. I like that challenge of like, okay, now what's my backup path?
Yeah, Ryan was definitely really leaning heavy on your player power.
I was jumping all over.
I mean, he was spending 4 of his 5 just hopping, grabbing something, hopping, dropping something off.
Yeah, it's the best way to do it.
But that is Ice and Idols. If you have any questions at all about it, make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and talk to you about whatever you want to talk about. Until next time, though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.